Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Varsek. I'm the exhibitions director at the Duluth Art Institute. And tonight we're meeting with painter Ann Magnusson. Ann holds a BFA from the University of Minnesota and an MFA from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. Her work has been exhibited throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin and can be viewed at her studio in the Minneapolis's Northrop King building. Magnusson is a fiscal year 2018 recipient of an Artist Initiative grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board. Her current exhibition at the Duluth Art Institute is titled Personal. It'll be on view April 1st through June 1st of this year. Hi, Ann.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm excited about this.
Me too. Thank you so much for participating in a virtual artist talk. I'm really excited. Your work is going to be on view in person come April 1st. So it's a treat to have you here tonight virtually and in person in the near future with your work on the walls.
Okay.
So I wanted to start our interview with talking about the quote that you often associate with your work. And I'll read that for everyone. Place tells a story about us. As soon as we put people in paintings, people tell the story about place. Wim Wenders. He's a German filmmaker and photographer. And Ann, can you tell us a little bit about that quote and how it applies to your work?
Yes. When I started this series about 7 or 8 years ago, at the same time, I listened to a conversation that Wim Wenders had at the Louisiana Museum of Art in north of Copenhagen. And in that, he said that quote about place, which I thought was so interesting because it was exactly what I was starting to deal with. And to explain that, my process is to have 2 paintings, one of which is a empty space or a space with no individual in it. And that, I think, is the place that he's talking about, that tells the story about the person who's the missing person. And then I also have a second painting, a companion painting with a portrait of an individual. And as he said, as soon as you put people into the painting, people start to tell the story about place. So there's this beautiful, I think, conversation that starts taking place between the interior and the portrait of the person. If that explains.
I see. And yes, and a lot of your process involves first interviewing people. Like, how do you meet your subjects and how do you get to know them?
That's a difficult part of my process, but it's also a part that I love. When I first started the process as I said, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was experimenting to see if it was even a viable series. And I would hang the paintings in my studio space. I have a working space in the Northrop King building, but also a display space. And people would come in and look at the work. And I would start sharing the stories of, oftentimes it was relatives in the beginning. And they would find it very interesting. And they would say, well, where do you find your people? How could I possibly be part of this series? And that's hard. It's sort of how it started. If they seemed interesting, if they had an interesting story, I would oftentimes ask them if they'd like to participate. And so it just sort of catapulted from there. Later on, when I decided to take this series to southern Minnesota, I used, sorry, I have a little bit of a sore throat or something today. I used social media to find a woman from Myanmar who had grown up in a not a concentration camp, but a camp in Thailand, and then made her way to Minnesota. And that was through social media. Word of mouth. If I'm going to a new area, I oftentimes will go into the town and sort of canvas and check out, maybe coffee spots and just read local newspapers to find people that might be of interest to me and people who also might be interested in participating.
Great. And how about the 4 subjects that you have on view in this exhibition? How did you meet them?
Well, that one was lucky because I really didn't know anyone from Duluth when I decided to take the series to Duluth. Um, as I said, I'm part of the Northbrook King building, and we have open studio events there a couple times a year, and first Thursdays that are open. And I have a good friend who has a studio just across the hallway from mine, who's a potter, and she had found Ashley, who is part of my series, and asked her to come down as a guest artist and display in her studio. And so, of course, I was in there and I was looking at Ashley's work, and I loved her work and I loved her appearance. And I thought, oh, she'd make a great painting. So I asked her to come into my studio and see my work, and I told her about my series. And I said, when I go to Duluth, would she be interested in participating? And she said, absolutely. So that's how that connection took place.
Great. And once you met Ashley and you meet your subjects in their home and you went to Ashley's home, what is it about the particular spaces that you tend to focus on in your eventual compositions?
Yeah, I never know. That's such an important part of my process, and I arrange with the participants what I call a home visit, and I tell them, I don't know the people, I've never been to their home, I don't know their interests, I really don't know much about them, which is sort of exciting. But they're all very gracious. They open their home to me, a total stranger. And I come in with only my iPad. It's very low key, low tech. And with my iPad, they take me to wherever they want me to be. I let them select. I don't decide anything on my own. And I just start looking around and just sort of randomly photographing with not really knowing even what I'm looking for. And I'll do some random photographs of the person too. But then we'll sit down, and again with my iPad, I will do a video of them. And the video may last 15 minutes, 30 minutes, however, usually until my battery runs out. But again, I'm not sure what I'm looking for because I don't know the person. And the video is the way for me to get into who I think they are, their personality, at least who they are revealing to me that day when I'm there for that hour and a half. That's all I know. And that's all I have to go on. But I always start it with a question. And I've used this question for all these years. And it sounds kind of silly, but it really opens up the field for me and for them as far as how they want to answer. And it is, if I were to paint you, and if the painting is a success and I hang it in my studio or wherever, and somebody were to come in and see the painting of you, what qualities do you hope that they would see in the painting that I made of you? Another way to put it, I suppose, is what do you think your essence is, or what qualities about yourself do you appreciate that you hope that I'm able to paint? And then that leads to the great conversation because it starts talking about them personally, and that's what I need to try to paint. So, and after that, once I've got that conversation recorded, I then ask to go back around in the room and look, because through that conversation, I've been given sort of clues as to maybe how to connect the person that I just felt through the audio or through the video, and what in the interior sort of reinforces that person that was revealed to me. And then also I do more photographing of the individual, and then I take it all back to my studio and put it all out on the floor. I'll make copies of photographs or whatever, and I have listen to the video again, and I start thinking about what reference material do I have that sort of matches my feeling of who that person was. Once I get that down, then it's an easier process because then I can start the painting and the drawing and the painting, etc.
Well, I thought in my mind, you're going into someone's home and taking some pictures and, potentially painting exactly what you see. Is that what you do, or do you pick out some of those objects and build a composition with your reference materials?
Yes, I do both. Um, I don't, what shall I say? I always think of myself as sort of a documentarian, if you will. I'm not editing really. I'm not changing things. I'm trying to present it exactly as it was. But there are some times when I think, maybe something needs to be moved around because I have to make a painting, you know, out of what I'm looking at. So sometimes I have to make revisions, as you say, but I try to be pretty true to what I see. I can eliminate if um, when I went to Brad, for instance, I was in his workshop and he has so many things and so much memorabilia that I couldn't possibly paint it all when I was working on his portrait. So I found myself eliminating, editing, and doing some things maybe with his portrait that taking some liberties, some freedoms that I don't usually do when I do the portraits. But I did do it with him, and I actually like the results of it. So.
How about Ramona's piece? Because in her portrait, in the background, you can see one of her granddaughter, Ashley, one of her pottery pieces.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, I was just asking if that was in view from the pictures that you took, or is that something you placed into the painting?
In the portrait that I did of Ashley, I put one of her pieces beside her, which wasn't there. So in that one, I added something. When I went to Ramona's home, who is Ashley's grandmother, her house was filled with Ashley's art, both paintings that Ashley had done in her sculptural pieces. It was lovely. There's 4 pieces, I believe, that are standing on her credenza in the background that were there. And I think I may have added one to the portrait that I did of her. No, I think there's 2. I'm trying to remember exactly how that looks. So I did move around a couple of the pieces, not when I was at the home, but when I was doing the painting. Yes. And I will say it was a little bit difficult with when I went to Duluth with COVID, because Ramona was the last person that I was interviewing. And all of a sudden it was March and things were closing down. And I had just briefly gone to Ramona's home and been able to do some photographing, but not a lot. And I really didn't even get an interview with her. Had it not been for COVID, I would have gone back several times and looked and re-looked at what I was doing and also gotten the interview. As it was, I had to ask her to send me her story. I was very interested in her, the story of herself and then her grandmother, who was one half Ojibwe and lived in Duluth. And I thought that was such an interesting connection. And then to Ashley also, but I couldn't get back there. So she had to give me a written story about that. Karen was the second person that I met when I was up there. And I think I got her name through Ashley. And I was very interested in the fact that she was a hair work artist who had studied in Sweden, because my husband is from Sweden and I lived there 13 years. So, and I had been to the area where Karen actually studied in Vomhus. So I thought and she was very gracious enough to participate too. So that was my 4 people.
And in what other ways did COVID impact this exhibition in particular? In terms of your expressive ability to create?
Yeah, I had a very difficult time. After I found the 4 people and I noticed things started to close down, it wasn't as serious as it became. So it was still, I started with Brad, and I think the painting was a lot looser. My painting style was a lot looser compared to the way it became later on. I like to do a very fluid underpainting and then keep aspects of that underpainting as I work on the figure and then tighten up the brushstrokes with the figure. And that, I think I maintained some of that with Brad. But as we got farther into COVID and I started then working on Karen and then Ashley and Ramona, I noticed I wasn't, there was a heavy over all of us, and my brush strokes started to change. And I usually stand up when I paint and I approach the canvas and go back. I have this sort of fluid movement, with the paint application, and initially anyway. And I noticed without even thinking about it, I started sitting down more, and I didn't want to move as much. And instead of painting with my arm, I started working a lot with my wrists. So all that affected the quality of the paint, and it became tighter. And whereas before sometimes mistakes didn't bother me, I started fretting over those mistakes and trying to change things. So, it would have been unnatural if I wouldn't have been affected by it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you brought up that fluidity of the background, and I wanted to bring up the background that is behind you right now. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those two paintings, because I think they hold some significance.
They do. They are the portrait elements to two paintings that I did. The one of the man that you can see, his name is Werner, and he is from Sweden. He is my husband's brother-in-law. So when I was there, and I wanted to test this idea that I had of a series, and he was very photogenic and sat for me actually as I was working on it. And it was the very first painting I did. So this is the portrait of Werner. I also did one of his interior. I don't have that hanging up. In the earliest paintings, I had the entire figure in the portrait section in that companion part. If you notice in the Duluth, it's more the heads. I became more and more interested as the farther along I got in the series. But initially, I showed the entire figure. And just to talk a little bit more about that, that sense of interconnectedness that I have with all of my paintings. Everything in this series, the original series, was 18 by 24, 24 by 30. And I wanted similar sizes because I wanted to show that each participant, there was a connection among all of the participants. When I went to Duluth, the sizes are all 30 inches by 24 inches, but they're all, again, the same size because I want that sense of they're all interconnected. They're part of a group. And then in the original here, you see that it's a limited color pattern. It's called Earth Tone Primary Triad, and I use only 3 colors plus a white. I have a brown, it's a burnt sienna, which goes to the reds. So that's my Earth Tone Primary. And I have a Payne's Gray, which can either be a black or a blue when I add white to it. And then the yellow ochre, which can have that sort of earthy tone, but when you add white to it, it goes more to the yellows. And I use that same color palette. I've used it all these years with all my paintings, again, because I like the idea that if you were to take all of my paintings from all the years and put them together, there is a cohesive component to that, and they're all speaking to one another. As I've gone farther along the paintings, and we can go to Duluth, Ashley, for instance, had this gorgeous reddish orange salmony color that in her clothing and in some of the chairs, the padded chairs that she had. And I couldn't get even close to creating that. So sometimes I allow myself the luxury of using it was a cad red light but then I would add my burnt sienna to it to create something still cohesive in the color palette, but that would more reflect her color choice in her room. I thought that, and the same with Brad. He had a very interesting green in his studio that I chose to use. So sometimes I take that liberty or freedom, depending on the person. And the other thing that with these originals, the labeling, I decided that I was going to make layering of information. You look at the interior, you get some information. You look at the portrait, you get another layer of information about the person. And so then I decided that the title, I would very specifically have the title be their name, originally age, but I took that out. Too many people reacted to that. But I thought that was an interesting, it said something about the interior when you thought about the age, but I eliminated that. So now it is the first name only and then the occupation, because that's a clue, a visual, or a clue, a layer of information for you about trying to figure out who this person is that is being painted.
What other kind of reactions from your subjects do you get when they see their portrait? You mentioned, some of them potentially reacting to the age being a part of the title. Do your subjects, do they learn something about their own lives through this process?
I don't know about that. That's such an interesting question. I always, before a show, I always send files to everyone and they can look so they see. They may not always be to their liking, or there may be things that they'd like to change, but it's sort of, the way I decided to paint them, and I try to leave it at that. And the comments are always, of course, they're very complimentary, and nobody says, "Oh, I hate this" or anything like that. They're always very gracious and kind, as they are throughout the entire process. I did have, when I was in eastern Minnesota, western Wisconsin, and I had a show at the Phipps, must be 2 years now ago, and I painted a poet there, and I loved his response. He sent me a letter, a thank you letter, and he talked about looking at himself in the portrait that I made of him through my eyes. And so he described it in such a beautiful way. And so I put that as his quote under his painting. So that's maybe the only one that I've had that kind of response from. But the other thing is that I have noticed is, although I tell everyone the size, I think that they sometimes are overwhelmed by it when they walk into the space for an opening, for instance, and they see themselves, especially in the later years, as large. They don't realize that they are going to be as large as they are. And the Duluth paintings and also the paintings at the Phipps, the heads are larger than normal. And I think they're a little bit overwhelmed. But I must say, I love the openings. And I so wish that there could be an opening in Duluth, because I become an observer, and I'm watching people come up and look at the people that I painted, but I'm also observing, as I stand in the background, my participants, my subjects, looking at themselves. And then all of a sudden, somebody who's looking at the particular painting will turn and see the person that I painted standing and, looking at themselves. So it's this great reaction that starts taking place, almost like a conversation, a quiet conversation, as people notice different things about what's going on. And I love that part of it. So.
Wow. How about, in this exhibition, Impersonal, that's in the Duluth Art Institute Corridor Gallery, we do have some additional companion pieces of portraits that you painted of, I think we have 2 of Karen and 2 of Ashley that are installed.
Okay.
And, is that something that tends to be a part of your process, doing multiple portraits of a subject, or is this just one of those COVID things that happened?
Yeah. Well, if we take Karen first, the portrait, I really like Karen's portrait. It just worked for me. It just worked for the person that I met, this really kind, generous, intelligent person, and it just with this sparkle. And to me, that's Karen. And I loved the wispiness of her hair. You know, she's the hair work artist who deals with human hair, makes jewelry out of human hair. And then when I did her interior, I sort of played around with the wispiness and the hair taking over. But I don't think that people understood her process. And the process was so important. These tripod stands that she uses to braid or weave, and how that works. So I thought, oh, I'm just going to experiment and see if that might be her portrait instead. And so I did that, but I liked it because it showed the process. But I really enjoyed the larger portrait that I did of her. So in that case, I had time and I wanted to experiment with it. But it's nice that you're showing it too. With Ashley, I had such a difficult time capturing Ashley. This wonderful woman, this, very young woman, beautiful. And so I had one image when I went in there, and then during the interview with her, I became like the young person I felt, and she became the wise woman, and talking to me about her experiences and her attitude toward her life and her work. And I felt like I was talking to an elder or something, and I was gaining information from her. So I had different images of her when I went home, in my mind, that is. She was also the mother of a young child who came down and wanted snacks, and their young husband who came down, and, all these other things. But then the conversation was so very, I was just mesmerized listening to her. So I had a hard time when I went back home trying to decide who to paint, or what aspect of Ashley I should paint. And so I really, then also deep in COVID, I started to flounder quite a bit with hers. And I'm not sure that I truly succeeded. And that's just the way it is sometimes, But I must say I made about 3 or 4 attempts on of Ashley.
Well, I think another interesting twist to the exhibitions that we have on view right now is that both Ashley and Karen are a part of the clay artists at the Duluth Art Institute exhibition that's happening, opening with the depot's reopening on April 1st. So people can go and see both of their artworks. And, Karen is, her pottery also has some hair jewelry on it, and some braiding. So people can really incorporate those two exhibits together. And Ashley has 3 pieces as well. So it's a really fun collaboration that it was just unplanned timing, but it's a fun side note.
Sure.
Yeah. So what are you working on now? How are you staying inspired now that this series is complete and it's installed? And what's going on with you artistically?
Well, I've done this series for probably 7 years, 8 years. And my intent was always, I wanted to go to Western Minnesota. I wanted to, I've been Southern Minnesota, I've been Eastern, Northern. I wanted to go to Western Minnesota. And now, of course, with COVID, and even as more and more people are vaccinated, I just don't see that working anymore with the series. I don't know that I will be comfortable going into someone's home. And I think it'll be years or before people will want strangers coming into their private spaces. So, it's with recognition that the series has ended for me now. And I must say, I have loved doing this series. I have loved all these people who have, opened their homes to, a total stranger. Let me come into their home, and they let me see their private spaces. They share their personal stories with me, and they've been more than gracious. So I really love that human contact that I've had with them. But it's over now, and I've had a little bit of a sense of melancholy, I guess. It's a series that I didn't really want to end, but it has ended. Um, so I have been, I'm always thinking. I may not be always painting, but I'm always thinking about where 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 I will be going. So I've been doing sketching. I've been doing some basic drawings, things like that, but nothing that's been exciting to me. And I was on the website. I was at the New York Studio School's website, and I wanted to see about their marathons because I thought if something would get me going again, it would be participating in a marathon. I have a good friend in the Twin Cities who was adjunct faculty at MCAD for quite a few years, and she had participated in this marathon, these rigorous marathons, many years ago, and they are still going on. So as it turned out, they had what they called an intersession marathon. It was only a 5-day versus 14 days, but believe me, 5 days was plenty. And it was 8 in the morning until at least 6 o'clock at night, with supposedly an hour for lunch, but that hour was probably 20 minutes. You'd rush upstairs and get something to eat and then rush down. I couldn't be in the studio building because I didn't have adequate internet connection. Everything was done on Zoom. But it was so rigorous, and I was so exhausted at the end of every evening, but I loved it. And it just took me in a whole different, it just started me thinking about art history and how we can go back to art history for ideas and for, so we referenced historical works, and then at the same time, we switched off with models. So it was back and forth the whole time. And then sometimes we would insert the model into these paintings that we were transcribing. It was just very different, very rigorous, but I loved it. And I'm going to continue working on that vein for a while. I have no idea where it will take me, but at least it's really got me motivated again, and I'm kind of excited. And it's been kind of a lull for a few months now for me, and I'm really excited again now to see what happens. You know?
Well, that's great. It sounds like you found some inspiration in all of this, and I think a lot of artists are struggling right now in terms of producing work and finding a passion to work toward, because everything feels very mundane right now, but it also feels hopeful, I think, in the next few months. So do you think you're going to get a chance to come up to Duluth and see the exhibition in person?
Oh, I would love to. Now I'm just fully vaccinated now. And, in time, then I can do that. And I think if everyone is masked, I think that I will do that. And I'm also returning to the school, or to my studio, I should say, not school, but to my studio now. So, which I hadn't been all winter. So that feels good too. So yes, I think I will be more mobile, and definitely I want to get up to Duluth. And I think you said the show goes to June 6th or something like that, or is there a beginning of June?
I think right now we have it on the schedule for until June 1.
Okay, June
1st.
And so for sure I will get up there. Yes. I would like to make sure that Brad and Karen and Ashley and Ramona, if they're listening to this today or watching, I want to just say a huge thank you to them for participating. As I said, it's not easy to open your home to a stranger. I would have second thoughts about doing it myself. So I am so eternally grateful to these people who do it for me. So a big thank you to them. And I would also like to say thank you to you and to the Duluth Art Institute for your generosity and for hosting my show. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. We're so grateful to have your work on our walls. And I do remember at one point when we were talking about your exhibition and the 4 portraits that you would have, you had wondered if maybe it would be enough, because I think way before COVID, there was this possibility of having more portraits. Mm-hmm. And I made the suggestion of doing a self-portrait in your own interior. And that didn't seem to float very well. And so I just say that because I know you sincerely mean it with your gratitude towards your subjects, because you recognize in yourself, it would be really hard to have someone in your home. So I also want to thank all 4 of the participants in this show. And I hope they are also able to swing by the corridor once we're open again on April 1st and see the work in person.
I hope so too. Yes.
Alyssa, I know Alyssa's listening in. Do we have any questions from chat?
Yes, I did live in Sweden. My husband is Swedish. He's from Sweden. He came over as an exchange visitor, and we met that way. And eventually we married and then moved after we were married directly to Sweden. So I lived there for 13 years. My children were born, and that was their first language. They were born there, and that was their first language. And then after a certain amount of time, we came back to the States. So yes. But thank you for that question. No, I used to work in oil paint. I just can't handle the terps anymore. It's in the odors. It's just too toxic for my body. So I use acrylic, and acrylics they've developed them. So now I use a brand called Golden that I love and has nice viscosity, and they have all different kinds of mediums that you can use with the acrylic, so you can get watercolor effects, or you can get very thick impasto. You can do basically whatever you want with it. And I'm fast. I'm slow, but I'm fast. I'm very fast when I paint. So it works for the way I like to paint. It dries faster, much faster, of course, than oil. So I can work the painting without sitting and waiting for things to dry. I can just continually go up to the painting and not worry about, smearing or whatever that I don't really want. It's a good medium for me to use. And I work on canvas, stretched canvas too. So, yay.
Great. Well, Ann, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your talents. And we look forward to seeing you in person, even though we'll look different because we will be masked at the depot come April 1st. The doors will be open. So I hope everyone's able to take in your exhibition and the other exhibitions that are on view as well. So thank you, Ann.
And thank you so much again. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.